Sorry for that. Okay, sorry. Our session today will talk about how might GeoChatGPT change the future path of Geospatial. The speaker will be Matt Sheehan, and I'm really thank him to accepting our invitation to be a speaker in this event. He is a 25-year veteran of the geospatial industry, starting out as a developer. He is now focused on transiting geospatial data and technology into business value. Matt believes geospatial is at an inflection point, driven by new data and automation powered by AI and ML. He is a strategy and solutions director in Insight. For the moderators of this event will be Dr. Noha. She is event and training coordinator. Letwin as Southern African Zonal Coordinator, and me, Safinaz, as North African Zonal Rep. Also, Hanin, he is an Assistant North African Zonal Coordinator. Firstly, we'll start a brief introduction about our community in 5 minutes. Will be presenting by Dr. Noha Abdelwarth. Dr. Noha. The floor is yours. You can talk.
Okay, thank you, Safinaz. Thank you all. Thank you all for your attendance to our session today. Thank you, Mr. Matt Sheehan, for accepting our invitation. Now I will take you in a quick tour about in African Women in GIS community. Okay. We are a community made up of African women around the world who work, study, or are enthusiastic about the geospatial industry and its related fields. The community aims to allow its members to be themselves, create networks, gain mentors, gain career advice, partake in geo projects to improve their portfolios, access job opportunities, as well as geo-course information and showcase their work to the world. Our mission is to create a safe space for African women in the geospatial industry, irrespective of their career level. And our vision, we aim to bridge the gender gap in the African geospatial industry. These colors are indicated to our identity. Green indicated to our love is indicated to our love for nature. Black is to unity and support among members. Gray to gender equality, and white to safety and safe space. How we start? At first, the community started out as a two separate countries groups. Chidma create Women in GIS in Nigeria in July 2017, and Sayana create Women in GIS in Ghana in April 2019. In June 2019, Chidma and Sayana met on LinkedIn and discussed reasons for creating their communities. So they merged their communities to African Women in GIS in October 2019. The members then were 41 from Nigeria, 11 from Ghana, and 1 member from Burkina Faso. Then the community was made public on social media in January 2020. Now, our community is growing with about more than 500 members residing in more than 30 countries of African countries. And our members residing in Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Egypt, and South Africa. We also have more than 9,000 followers for social media platforms. This map shows the location of our members. So what is the problem that influenced our existence? The problem that influenced our existence was that African GIS industry and other STEM fields are predominated by men. Also, there are a lack of female role models and career guidance in accessible GIS job information. Also inaccessible and unaffordable GIS events and courses. GIS lack of potential awareness and lack of grassroots awareness. So how are we contributing to solving these challenges? Our contributions could be summarized in 4 words: networking, learning, mentorship, and awareness. Our community activities are available for all people, except the mentorship is restricted only to women. This is some examples of our events and activities, like International Women's Day in 2020, ISRI-UC in 2020, other internal events. Also, when we gave the opportunity to our members to be speakers in our events and encourage them to speak, to help build awareness and increase representation. Also, we have some active collaboration with Geospatial community and companies. Now, in our site, our website allow members to be contacted for speaking, consultations, jobs, and any other geo-related opportunity. And we now have African Women in GIS blog, articles written by our members there and published here. Our African Women in GIS YouTube channel or recording of our events and training programs can be found there. Also, the recording of this sessions and the last session will be available here. We held some physical meetup in our countries. So we hope to continue to contribute to bridging the gender gap in the African geospatial industry and create more awareness of the geospatial field. This is some highlights about the mentorship program. which was held in 3 cohorts. This map shows the stories of the profile highlight of our mentees. Now you can access to this story map and view our mentees stories. The link will be sent in the chat box. Now, our community has created a platform which is a source of motivation for African women to take up career paths in GIS. We aim to expand in the coming years to support more African women in the GIS industry and introduce the younger generations to GIS careers, help African benefit from the application of GIS and its related fields, always as fundamentally bridging the gender gap in the African geospatial industry. Please follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and our website. The links of our social media platforms will be sent now in the chat box. And now we use the geospatial world through the eyes of the African woman. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Noha. Now let's move to our speaker, Mr. Sheehan. Can you hear me?
I can. Hello.
Yeah, hello. We are glad to have you today, and we are waiting for the exciting and wonderful talk about GeoChatGPT. Okay, the floor is yours. You can start.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I'm honored to be invited to this event. I didn't know about African women in GIS. What I've just seen is wonderful. So your goals and your mission is I thoroughly support, and I think is terrific. So we live in an interesting time, I would say. That's how I would start this talk. I think you may end up with more questions and answers from what I'm about to tell you, but hopefully it opens some thought processes and around this evolving world of geospatial. The focus of the talk will be AI, and specifically where we started to move to with ChatGPT. But I have a loose, and you'll see me looking to the right here every once in a while. I've got a kind of a loose outline. We'll see where we go with. So I'm going to try not to talk for too long. I think an hour might be too long for folks, so I'll rattle through this, and we'll have a question session at the end. Let's begin. I was going to introduce myself to begin with. I'm Matt Sheehan. I think most of you probably live in quite warm places. I live in Salt Lake City, and about 5-6 miles up the road from me, there are 15-foot walls of snow. So we live in a very cold, we're having a very cold winter here, and there's another blast of snow coming. So it's been unusually cold here. So I would say I envy you folks that are living in warm climates, because here people were desperate for some warmth. So about me, I would say I'm an independent thinker in the world of geospatial. You'll probably see that as I talk today. And for those folks that follow me on LinkedIn, probably follow me because I take a slightly different perspective on our amazing world of geospatial. I live, like I mentioned, I live in Salt Lake City, so I live in the Western US. I'm British, you can tell from my accent. I did a physical geography degree in London University many years ago, came over here, did a GIS degree at the University of Utah. I actually wrote a web GIS application in 1996, which was kind of very early into that world. I've spent part of my career as a developer, so I've worked on the technical side of the geospatial GIS world. And I've spent the second half of my career in business, so I've actually touched on many parts of the GIS world, which has given me an interesting perspective, and some of that will probably come out today. So let's dive in. I wanted to, on our journey to AI and into ChatGPT and GeoChatGPT, I thought it good, and again, not knowing the audience, I'm gonna sort of presume some things here, but I thought a journey from where we've been would be good to understand where we've got to now and potentially where we're going. So indulge me, I'm going to just share with you a little bit more about the history of GIS and geospatial. So I came into GIS in the 90s. Then it was still a desktop-based technology. Esri were the dominant GIS company, still are. They had been around, I think, since 1969. So GIS had been around for a long time. I came into GIS when we were going through a transition. So we were moving from a world which was, again, desktop-based to the web. And I was fortunate enough to be at the University of Utah, which was part of what's called the ARPANET. So we were one of the few universities that actually had access to the early version of the internet. So I saw the web in 1992, probably. And I thought this is going to be a big game changer. And it turned out to be. And there were some naysayers when I started work on my graduate degree who were suggesting, this is never going to take off. This is a fad. We can't afford marketing, all of those type of things. But to me, it was obvious that networking computers together was going to be a massive deal. And for me, who had just come from England, moved to America, it meant I could connect in, I'm a Chelsea fan in England, anyone that follows the Premiership. So having access to all those type of things was a big deal to me. So I knew it was going to be big. So that was really the first giant leap for GIS was from the desktop to the web. And we still have desktop GIS remains very important, but that was the first kind of giant leap where technology affected our world, and we started to build, and that was my work. I built GIS applications, web applications. So let's fast forward to around about 2005. The web was useful, people were learning how to use it, but GIS on the web was very crude. Then Google Maps came out, and we had what's called Slippy Maps. So the whole experience of working within a web environment on a map was completely altered. It meant that when one zoomed and panned, there was this natural flow to everything. And again, when we see web maps today, everything flows beautifully, but it didn't prior to 2005. So let's move to 2009. That was when, just around there was where the first iPhones came out. They were just before that, but the first iPad, the first large screen mobile device came out. That was kind of the birth of mobile GIS, where we had a big enough screen to actually view the map. We had GPS built into this mobile device that we could move around in. So that was another giant leap for our industry. In general, it was a giant leap. For us, it was a giant leap because suddenly location became important. And so many mobile applications were built on phones, on tablets, which had a locational component to them. So that was another giant leap. So we've kind of evolved with technology and become a mobile technology, a web technology, and a desktop technology. So we've grown. But GIS has remained an expert-only environment. And people would argue with me against that no, it's become more available. But no organization that has GIS doesn't have a GIS department, or at least GIS experts within. So GIS remains, we could debate this, but it remains sort of within the expert world. The web and mobile has made it easier, but it still remains in that world. I realized about 5 or 6 years ago that we were going through another phase change. When I studied in GIS, you couldn't get data. Data was really hard to come by. Google Maps allowed us to get access to a wider spectrum of data, which is another one of the big things that provided us. But all of a sudden, we started to miniaturize sensors. So how does that relate to GIS? It meant that we could actually start putting technology into devices that are on the ground, in the air, and in space, which could collect geospatial data. And fundamentally, one has to remember GIS is based around location data. That's the fundamental place that GIS sits. But GIS has always been this kind of mapping technology. I mean, when I did my graduate degree, I wondered why I'm a geographer. Why did I become a map maker? So even though the world of GIS is changing, my association and my work with GIS has always been around 2D mapping, interactive 2D mapping, points, lines, and polygons for those students or those who remember the studies we did at college. But those sensors have meant that we've started to converge. The industry started to converge. So we used to have GIS over here, and I know a lot of you are probably GIS folks. we had this other area called remote sensing over here, and they were sort of disconnected. I remember being at college and the first couple of jobs I had where we had remote sensing sort of in the same department of GIS, but different disciplines. And remote sensing originally was primarily imagery, primarily photogrammetry. Again, it's location-based data, and products were generated from remote sensing that we used in GIS, but they remained sort of separate areas. Well, those sensors really fall into the world of remote sensing. So what do I mean by sensors? I mean, yes, imagery. I now mean LiDAR, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Thermal, hyperspectral, which is where we can identify species of trees, for example. Multispectral, where we can understand, let's stay with the vegetation analogy, where I can tell the health of trees. So we can actually start building out new data sets based off of these new sensors. So the big change that I recognized about 7 years ago probably was we now have this tsunami of new data coming from remote sensing. And the industry over the last 7 years has begun to converge. So I no longer call myself a GIS person, because I'm not. I'm a geospatial person. Geospatial actually means place on Earth. So I define myself as someone who works with location-based data, be it vector data in a GIS, be it remote sensing data in the different forms that comes out of there. So we're in a changing world. What does that look like to people that we work with? Well, 2D maps, 3D maps, and 4D data. So we're into this new world where we're not just talking about, and again, GIS still is largely focused in the 2D mapping world. But if anyone that's attended any of the recent Esri conferences has seen that Esri themselves are beginning to move into these other areas. Velocity is a new cloud-based real-time data technology that's part of ArcGIS Online. That's new. The 3D stuff, the virtual ArcGIS, it's just been announced. Again, we're beginning to see GIS move from the sort of 2D world into this 2D, 3D, 4D world. Now that's really important, because now when we work with people, we can start talking about not just what value a 2D map brings. And I will always argue that a 2D map is an abstract version of the world, which provides a certain insight for folks. It means that I can see patterns. I can load a lot of data and I can see patterns. I can see relationships. This notion of where. Maps have this real value in narrowing down areas of interest. An example would be in the transportation world. Where are those intersections in a city that are most problematic because of crashes? Well, you can see that in a 2D map. But suppose I wanted to look at that intersection. I need to either drive out to the intersection or get a digital twin of that intersection. There's that digital twin word, which we hear a lot about. So what is a digital twin? Well, it's a three-dimensional version of that intersection. So it's a much narrower viewpoint, as if I was standing at that corner of that street, and I can look around. I can do measurements if it's LiDAR-based data. So I get a much more, without having to drive there, I can have that experience as if sense of place, I often call it. And I can also enrich that data as well. So for example, if I'm looking at a three-dimensional version of an intersection, I can add point data from a GIS where those crashes happened. That's incredibly valuable. So we're now beginning to build out this 2D to 3D. 4D just means change. So 4D is IoT, 4D's cars moving through intersections, pedestrians moving through intersections. So where we've moved to in geospatial is this combination of multi-dimensional data to help folks get a better, get to a place where they can take actionable insight. That's the common terminology that people use in our world, is actionable insight. So how do we guide people down that path? Well, the combination of those data sets potentially bring people to a new understanding of a problem. So our world's changing. The one thing I haven't mentioned is artificial intelligence. So critically, when you have massive data sets, it's overwhelming for us to actually process that data. We need to automate the process. And that's where automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning have come in. And we started to build out these AI algorithms over the last quite a number of years. And again, I think that word automation is key. We're taking manual processes and automating them. Just like back in the day, the Luddites in England, They were destroying the machines in the factories because they were going to lose their jobs. So I sympathize with the Luddites, even though they were a long time before I was ever born. But that was the automation of the journey from manual working to machines replacing people. AI, machine learning, has the ability to do that. And I'll talk about, are we about to lose our jobs in a minute? So the driver behind AI in our world is how do we process and analyze all this enormous amount of data that we're getting, multidimensional data. So that's kind of that's been the big driver behind AI. But I wanted to talk briefly about reality versus hype. There's been a lot of talk about what is artificial intelligence, but we all have to remember that a lot of what we're seeing as this magical output is actually being done in India and other countries. So there's still a lot of manual stuff that goes into the world of AI, the identification things and images. So we shouldn't be fooled into thinking it's all algorithms and now there's, there's no people behind the scenes. There still is a lot of people hidden. There's lots of companies that are providing people who are manually working through things. So we live in this sort of hybrid world where there's a lot of folks that are quietly in the background of AI and there's real work being done. And I'm not a data scientist, so if someone can argue against what I've just said, but I know that there's a whole world of manual stuff still going on. But as we move forward, we're automating things. And so that journey is, we're sort of at the early stages of that. What I would say about AI and where we've been with AI, which is important to this conversation, is AI is a background process. AI is something that happens that we don't see. So for example, I'll give you an example in my world. So I work NV5, primarily a remote sensing company. So we process data that's collected with these sensors. A lot of times it's fixed wing aeroplanes that we fly over transmission lines, for example. We bring in this raw data. I use the analogy actually of kind of the oil industry. We dig the oil up, we process the oil, we do something special with it, and we sort of deliver it to a gas station, that end product we put into our cars. In many ways, the remote sensing industry has become kind of like that we actually process these enormous amounts of data and we deliver a data product at the end of it. Chunks of that work now is done by AI. So within our company, we have a team of AI folks that are building algorithms to go through to help process that data and do analytics on that data. And I'll touch on the analytics in a minute. But does that mean that we don't have any people in the background working? No, we have absolute geniuses working on this stuff. Will they ever go away? No, they'll never go away. We always need experts in the imagery world, in all of those areas I've just mentioned, because just like a pilot in an aeroplane, aeroplanes can fly themselves now, but the pilot's only there to make sure that nothing goes wrong. And if it does go wrong, he jumps in. These people that are experts in the remote sensing field are all making sure that the output is correct, making sure that the algorithms are doing what they should be doing. So they're in that world. They're never going to go away. So to the question I asked earlier, are we all going to lose our jobs? I have a suspicion that most manual parts or chunks of manual parts of the GIS and geospatial world will start to go away. Do I think that expertise in GIS and these remote sensing areas going away? No, they'll never go away. But the need to actually do some of the manual grunt work that some of us I've had to do in the past, and maybe you guys do now, is going to go away. So there's new jobs. People will have more time to think about how to solve problems, actually, because the stuff that's a pain in the neck, we don't have to do anymore. Machines will do it. So I always advise folks that are at university, and some of you folks might be students still, learn some other skills beyond just learning how to use ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro or QGIS. Learn more than that, because I think a lot of the stuff that's we're currently doing, some of the grunt work, so to speak, AI will do. And this is actually leading us towards the ChatGPT conversation. So I'm kind of I'm gently going down the path. But I would advise people, if your job is a manual job, I would start to learn a wider set of skills. Programmers, again, another ChatGPT we'll talk about in a minute. Programmers, low-level programmers, your jobs are probably going to be replaced. So, don't want to be a scaremonger, but there we are. So I think what I was going to say really was, and this is kind of bringing us up to today, our industry is in a state of complete change. We're seeing amazing technological advances, but our industry in particular is going through some really dramatic changes. And it feels like we're between the old world and the new world at the moment. It's an interesting time to be working in the industry. And I remember going back to my history, I remember the impact the web had. That's huge. I remember the impact that mobile had. That was huge. But on top of the shoulders of those sort of technological advances is where we've got to today. And what we're experiencing today is on another scale. What we're looking at down the road. So I would say that it's already a little bit of a complex world that we're in. We have all these enormous amounts of data. We have it in it's a multitude of different types of data, already complex. And we've got AI and machine learning, which is helping us work through that stuff. So our world is really dramatically changing. Then came along ChatGPT. ChatGPT throws another level of confusion into the works. In the near future, it should ultimately be simplify our world, but it confuses it stirs the pot even more of what I've just mentioned before. So what actually, and again, I mentioned I'm no computer scientist, so I'm not going to give you any deep dive into ChatGPT. I will say that ChatGPT, why it's been such a surprise is because I mentioned that AI has sat quietly in the background. You know, it's kind of the engine that you never look at and under the bonnet of the car. Now we have AI in our faces. Now we actually have this world where we can directly interact, any of us, with AI. That's completely blown everything open. It's surprised everybody. And you'll hear a lot. I mean, I listen quite a lot to the world. I mean, Sam Altman is the CEO of OpenAI, the organization that came out with ChatGPT. He's a very interesting guy to listen to, but he comes out with terminology, which is completely, again, we live in a confusing world of terminology as geospatial folks, but there's new stuff coming out, which I'm listening to him thinking, what's he talking about? He's coming up with new terminology. And one, actually, I've got it over here. I have to remind myself what he said. It's AGI. He mentioned this term AGI. I'm like, what in heaven's name is AGI? Artificial General Intelligence. And I take that as being, it's not artificial intelligence in the background anymore. General suggests it's in our faces. It's stuff that we can use, stuff that is accessible to us. And, you know, there's this whole notion of large language models, LLMs, don't know anything about, not going to go into them, but that's the base of the ChatGPT is an LLM powered chatbot. So if you're on a website and something comes up to chat to you, that's a chatbot. This is a powered chatbot. Which has got these models behind it. And it's interesting to actually try to understand it. You've got this notion of generative AI as well, another term that's worth looking up, which is really describes what ChatGPT is. It's an image and text-based input-output source of AI. So it's that new world that has now suddenly all of a sudden appeared in our faces. Like, you know, one day it was this, and then all of a sudden crash bang walla, we've got this new world that's appeared. And a lot of times people really don't, again, we're all trying to figure out what this actually means. So I was going to talk about strengths and weaknesses of ChatGPT. Let me leave that for a minute, because I think some of the jury's out, because we really don't know yet. There's a lot of questions around what its value is, what it's going to give to us. There's the fear of what it's going to do. So I think we're really in an interesting place. One of the critical things that I think one needs to be aware of is the fact that it's a learning tool. So it's actually learning all the time from the input that you're giving it, the questions you're asking it, etc. So it's constantly learning. That's incredible. That's incredible. So it's actually teaching itself to get better. You know, the implications of that are enormous. So they're building their own knowledge base. And intelligence, there's a debate whether there is actually, it's building its own intelligence. We'll see. I think, again, it's an interesting place that we've entered. So then let's think about geospatial and the implications in geospatial. I think that if I look at our world today of geospatial has two challenges. The first one is it's very fragmented and it's an expert's world. And again, people would probably argue against that. People, story maps are easy to build and all these sort of things in Esri world and beyond. We got Carto doing some really nice things with their dashboard and maps. So it's become easier, but it's still an expert environment. And one of the reasons Esri got so successful, again, this is my opinion, but I lived it and saw it, was that they gave their software away to universities. So when I went to the University of Utah, I learned Esri. And when I left the University of Utah, guess what I did? I went into the public sector and I applied Esri technology because that's all that I knew. Now, open source was something I'd always sort of come across, and Esri always used to look at open source as a threat. I really don't think it is, but it used to be one of those ones that they looked at. But it's always in GIS departments. So, and it's generally in those sectors where there is a GIS department, and that's often in America, the federal, state, and local government sectors. It's also in those, the infrastructure as well. So utilities, transportation, oil and gas, all of those areas of you and I, some of you listening probably working in those sectors, I certainly did. That's generally where GIS sits. It's in those expert groups within organizations. Now, one of the things I've always thought about, and the sort of one of my goals in sort of working in this world, is the value of geospatial data. Again, not just GIS, I'm talking more broadly about the spectrum of geospatial data that we're talking about, has much wider potential impacts than it does out of one small department that is pumping out maps. So I think that well, let's just talk, I'll keep going before I jump into that. But so one of the challenges we've got is getting GIS and geospatial out of the hands of experts and into a much broader audience. And then the other thing is, it remains very poorly understood. So if you describe, when you go home to your family or your friends and they ask you what you do, how do you describe what you do? It's always been a struggle. I work in GIS, when nobody knows what GIS is. Oh, I work with maps. Is that really what you do? So it's a kind of a misunderstood world that we inhabit. And I think that that's something that is problematic, because the value, and it kind of goes back to the expert piece as well, the real value of what we do, and more generally, is not really widely recognized, and it's not necessarily utilized in the way that it could be utilized. And again, I look at organizations that have a GIS department, but they're not using it across the organization. They're not using, not necessarily GIS, but they're not using geospatial data in whatever application or access point they've got across the organization. And we know that our world is about people, places, and things. So geospatial is foundational to everything that we do. And yet we still are these little people sitting in the corner making 2D maps. I'm being controversial by saying that, but I think you probably get my point, that I think that the overall value of what we do and the data we work with has much wider implications. And so we live in a big niche, and at some point we will break out of that niche. And I think that's where we are now. We're breaking out of that niche to get to a bigger world, but the barriers are probably our own, I think. So again, how does that relate to ChatGPT? The conversations that started with GeoChatGPT were around those two foundational pieces. We've got this expert-only world. Again, I'm overstating that. We've got this expert world, and we've got a group the rest of the world don't understand. How do we bridge that gap? How do we bring this technology to a much wider group? So that's sort of where we started the journey in thinking about GeoChatGPT. Can we provide a chatbot to people who can ask geospatial questions? That could be an expert asking something very specific, or it could be a non-expert. So we started ideating around that after ChatGPT came out, and we started experimenting with what ChatGPT can do, and did some little work in the background on this stuff. But mostly it's us ideating. It's not, some people, when I wrote the first post on this, thought that, give me the access point and off I go. Well, no, it's not quite there. And actually, it would be foolish to actually start on that journey quite yet, because we're still the ChatGPT 4 has only just come out, and that's a big leap on 3.5. So there's a whole world of developments going on there. Remember, Microsoft owned 40% or 50% of OpenAI. They've put hundreds of millions of dollars into that. So there's a lot of money pouring into that. So I think that the idea that our geospatial thinking on where ChatGPT applies to us remains in that planning, thinking, again, within the group that I work within, that there's lots of conversations around where we might go next. So nothing's yet been produced, but we're beginning to be able to map out the path forward that we think this is going to take. So let me share a bit more with you on that one. One of the things that is, so generative AI is about text and it's about imagery. So you can ask a question and it'll give you an answer. You can get it to do programming for you and it will give you code back. You can now start working with this new release. You can now start working with images as well. So it's limited to that world. I say limited, that's very, very powerful. And there's lots of things around that, you know, Sam Altman talks about what questions should we or shouldn't we answer in this. You know, one can ask very offensive. One question he asked was, if you wrote in ChatGPT, how do I kill as many people as possible with $1? How does ChatGPT handle that? You know, that's massive. So there's massive questions that have to be sort of thought through with this. So we're very early stage of this, but I digress. The other thing that ChatGPT is built against is databases that they themselves have. I thought they'd just basically taken the 2-year-old version of the web and, you know, use that to answer questions from. They've actually done it a bit more sophisticated than that. They've cherry picked from lots of different places. So they built their own really, really massive database, and they're training this model against this big database. So that's interesting because we're all sort of a little bit, I mean, I shouldn't say that, I still use Google a lot, but the search engines now are filled with adverts. It's hard to find things. I don't think they're ever going away, but they're problematic, more and more problematic. And they come back with very poor information. Often you've got to weed way through it. ChatGPT is a much more way of getting narrowed down into an answer that you want, but it's built against the data that they've got. So it's only, you know, garbage in, garbage out. That's sort of where they live in terms of they can only provide a good answer if the database they've got is good. If it's not got the data in there, it can't really provide an answer. So it has limitations. And so I think where the conversations we've been having around this is that we believe that there's going to be a new industry forming around this whole generative AI world. So people will be building out their own LLM powered chatbots, but they'll be building their own databases. So what does that look like? One of the ones that I sort of mentioned in social media the other day was something, I made it up, you know, travel ChatGPT. If you want to travel, we still rely on books like Lonely Planet and Photos and these other books, and we look through these books and they're hard to find everything you need. And then we'll go on the web and we'll go to Airbnb and see if we can find the right place. And then we'll go and find recommendations from people on what they thought about that restaurant. So this can be kind of a painful process to get there. If Photos or Lonely Planet took their books, put them in a database, and then had external calls through APIs to the web, they would own a chatbot, which was a travel chatbot, which could answer any of your questions. So, you know, you can imagine questions like, I want to go to a European, I'm looking for a European city that has low crime, is by the beach, you know, I don't know, I'm making things up, but you can narrow things down by drilling down doing something like Travel ChatGPT to narrow down where you want to go. So you've isolated it's you know, Barcelona you want to go to. Then you answer those additional questions. So it's going to help us find the information that we need much more easily. But is ChatGPT going to do that? Maybe, but unlikely, I think, because ChatGPT is this broad thing. I think we'll be getting some much more focused versions of what we're talking about. So again, we'll watch this space. I know that Kayak have already started doing this work, but I have a sense that we'll be spawning out these other generative AI applications, and we'll get front ends to things and that enable us to find things very quickly, answer things quickly. So the whole search engine paradigm is probably going away, and it's going to be replaced, at least in part, by what we're talking about here. It's going to be very narrowly focused in particular areas. Yeah, more to come there. So GeoChatGPT, same kind of notion. And I will say that lots of people have begun to experiment in the geospatial world. I've been talking to Esri about this, and they're doing some interesting work. Lauren Bennett, who's been at Esri for a long time, she's actually just coordinating a meeting. You might look it up, talking about this actually, where generative AI is going, and Esri's placing that. So it's kind of a wider conversation, but I'm kind of interested. And some of the, I would say some of the, I have to give a shout out to Asaf as Esri. Him and I some while ago were actually chatting about this, and some of the sort of initial ideas around GeoChatGPT came from that conversation. So there's Esri are looking at it. A lot of us are looking at it. I'd point you at Earth Genome as well. They've got something called, I just wrote it down here, ChatGeoGPT. So I don't know whether they sort of munged around GeoChatGPT and thought, oh, that's gone, so we'll take this one. But they're doing some work with OpenStreetMap and generating maps from that. So check it out. There's quite a lot of conversations on the web in the geospatial world about where geospatial fits. So let's drive into, I'm getting towards the end of things, so I'm not going to hold you out very long, but we can have some questions. The last key topic here, which is really the title of this, is GeoChatGPT. So where did we come from with that? I mentioned the sort of the vision that we had for it to really solve that problem, to make geospatial more accessible. The original post that I pushed out about a month and a half ago that some of you may have seen, when I'm quite active, as I mentioned, on LinkedIn, and some of you probably follow me there, I generally get between 1,000 and 2,000 impressions in LinkedIn, whatever an impression is. Sometimes I think it's just eyeballs on things. I don't really know what the algorithm is and what that output is. So I get between 1,000 and 2,000. That post, that short post, got 150,000 impressions. So it sort of went viral. And it was a shock to us that went viral. And I still am mulling over that reaction. I think because it had ChatGPT attached to it, it caught people's attention. But I wanted to talk to you about how I structured that very short post in LinkedIn. And I'll use the analogy for cooking, actually. I think that's the best analogy I can come up with. And this is sort of the path that we're following in the thinking and sort of overall sort of approach within this sort of GeoChatGPT world. Again, which is really still at the early stages. It's really just sort of coming up with what we think might be the right approach. But I think that the mist sort of clearing a little bit on it. So I think there's three parts to it. Again, I'll use the analogy of cooking. I think when you read a recipe, you get multiple parts to that. You get the ingredients. I need an onion, your garlic, pasta. So there's the ingredients. You then get the key part of the recipe, which is the instructions on how to construct that meal. And then the third part of it is the meal. It's the cooked pizza. So how's that relevant to GeoChatGPT? The post that I put out was the first two pieces of that puzzle. I actually wrote a veg management focused question, and it was a very broad question. Again, utility companies with transmission lines, they're worried about trees falling on the power line. And in Western America, that means power outages, it means wildfires, very costly money-wise and potentially, threatens to life. So they're big deals. These companies spend a lot of money on clearing vegetation. So I wrote a question as if I was a person who's a non-geospatial person, just really trying to find an answer to how to solve the veg management problem. The answer was essentially the ingredients and the instructions for getting to an answer to that question. It wasn't the cooked pizza. It was simply, these are the things that you need, and this is how you would construct those things. And I purposefully worded it such that it was complex. There was hyperspectral data in there. In other words, we need to know what trees there are. Trees are important because, for example, ash trees in Western America, they've got a beetle that's infected them, which means a lot of them are kind of half dying or dead. Very problematic. So they need to know where these ash trees are. So the answer was really an output which described an overall journey to get into a solution. And it was a mixture of things. Could one geospatial expert have answered that question? No. Why? Because it was a combination of GIS data. Let me look at a 2D map. Let me look at those polygons which represent those trees, because the GIS doesn't generally have trees. So LiDAR data is often used to identify the trees. These other data sets like hyperspectral are things that allow one to identify in yellow, for example, on a 2-dimensional map. Well, that tree there, I can see the top of the tree as a polygon. That's an ash tree. Or using multispectral data, again, another remote sensing sensor technology, you can identify the health of those trees. So you've already started down the journey of isolating where, thanks to a mixing of these data sets, these problems are. You can then go into 3D and start looking in 3D as if you're standing there. And these are colored point clouds. So you've used LiDAR data to actually not only represent the 3D, that 3D world, but you've colored those that three-dimensional world. In red, that part of the tree is really close to the power line. You need to cut that. There's an ash tree in yellow. You need to cut that down. So it gives those utility companies a much better perspective, in the same way as I described earlier, the transportation example, on where they need to do the work quickly. And to those guys, they've got to get it done. It used to be a manual process. They would walk the line. So they do all of that work in the background. And again, AI is doing a lot of processing there. But where we're going with GeoChatGPT is we will be able to answer that question. Again, I underline, no one expert has that knowledge in their head. There's no one person I know I've never met that knows hyperspectral data and GIS and LiDAR. We all have our own places where experts in. GeoChatGPT potentially is that expert because it has the knowledge of each of those areas. So it can answer those kind of complicated questions. So the key to this is, where's that data? Where do I get that data from? And it goes back to that database question. ChatGPT is not designed to answer that question. It never will be. Why? It could potentially answer that question, but the information that's needed to answer that question is not out there. There isn't a guided tour on how to go through that. So the building of a database that's a geospatial database that's designed to answer those questions is critical. And I think that that's where GeoChatGPT, the path of GeoChatGPT. Now, that's kind of that second stage of what I spoke about. So ChatGPT can probably come out with the ingredients of what I've just described. And I've tested out different variations on site selection, for example, the vegetation one, the transport. I've tried different variations on the theme, and it can come out with vaguely the answers, but I've tried to get it to tell me about hyperspectral. No chance it comes out with hyperspectral. So it's kind of interesting to actually look and see that needs to be built. And it is this overarching knowledge base that covers all these expert areas. And it allows someone who is not an expert to ask what is a complex geospatial question. So that's kind of the path of it. That second step is important in more ways than one. And there's things that we're working on in the background, which are super critical towards getting a proper output. So let's talk about the cooked pizza. Those folks that are working against generating a map are working in simple terms. I'll get to the question. I know there's a question. They're getting there in simple terms, but can we then output a map from what we're talking about? Yes. And I think at the minute that there's a lot of work being done to generate against existing APIs maps. And again, you'll see some of the work in OpenStreetMap is where they're generating code from ChatGPT, pushing that out to an API, and then getting an answer back and putting it as a map. So the output would be the ultimate path to follow. But most of the work that's been done to date is two-dimensional maps asking very simple questions against very specific APIs. The vision that we have at GeoChatGPT, or the group that we're talking about, is to have a much more broader output than just sort of a simple map. I mean, the long-term perspective would be, I want to answer that vegetation management question. It's not just a two-dimensional map I want to look for. It's potentially a 3D map, and maybe it's 4D data as well. So it has the intelligence and knowledge to be able to actually produce the instructions on how to get there and potentially generating what's needed. So we're a long way from that yet. I actually believe that it's the first two steps, which was, they were the only two steps that are in that original post. They're the foundational pieces. I think the step two, the recipe instructions, and again, there's a lot more in that piece of the conversation that we can talk about than I'm going to talk about today, is a really critical step to getting to that step four. But our ultimate journey is to try and actually output things. And I'll leave one more point before I stop, is site selection is a classic example where commercial real estate people are looking to try and find the best location for a Starbucks in Salt Lake City. That is a very, very complex question to answer on the back end. And again, I think I did another sort of GeoChatGPT post on that. But at some point, we'll get to a place where we'll be able to actually answer really complicated questions like that. We're way off of that yet. And what we need actually is, and ChatGPT is a generative AI, so it works in text and imagery. What the output piece needs is actually a geospatial engine on the back end. So I take text from a chatbot and translate that into something that it can be geo-processed and generate something else. We're way off from that. So that's what I'm talking, that's my talk. I hope I didn't spend too long going. It opens up lots of questions, maybe more than answers, but I think hopefully there's some bigger jigsaw puzzles that I've sort of tried to connect here that has you guys thinking ahead. And some of you guys here will have more answers than I've got on some of this stuff. So, you know, you're the smart cookies out there. So I'll stop there. I think there were some questions, but I'll finish on that note.
Thank you, Matt, for this talk. If anyone have a question or anything, you can raise your hand and I will let you speak. And you will find our social media links. You can follow us. Haneen dropped it in the chat box. Also, a registration link for the certificate attendance. Certificate, you can follow the form and you will receive your certificate. Okay, if you have any question. Okay, Sharif, I will unmute you and you can talk.
Hello. Thank you so much for the amazing talk. It seems like AI will make a lot of changes in our future, like careers and stuff. But my question is, how secure is to work if I'm working for, sometime I work for very private companies, like very private matters, like in design or for mining industries, you need to be very private regarding their work. So how secure is to use AI in our work or to implement some of the tasks, for example, mapping, delineation, or generating geospatial data with AI? Is there a risk of exposing information, or if the information is very, what I would say?
Yeah, I understand your question. I think there's a danger there for sure. I wonder how, I mean, again, I think if one if one extrapolates what we're talking about here, we could set up a company that's called Travel GeoChatGPT, and that would be a company that would obviously serve the public. But what does one do with private data? It's, if we work within a firewall, that's not public information, but we might want our people inside the organization to find that. So could we use an internal version of ChatGPT to actually provide people access to the information they need, but not to the outside world? So I'm interested to think where this is all going to go to, but I have to think that we'll be going into a world where there's LLM powered chatbots everywhere, you know, serving out travel information, serving folks inside an organization privately. I think the implications from a privacy perspective are big, but in my mind, it's still that sort of firewall question. What do we allow the outside world to see? What do we allow the inside world to see? And I suspect ChatGPT would be just a, you know, an internal only tool for an organization. Yeah, their own ChatGPT is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Thanks so much. Yeah. My question was mainly about how secure is it, and but now if a company is developing its own ChatGPTs, then each company will develop its own ChatGPT, right?
That's my suspicion. I think that's what's going to happen. I think it's open up a world of a new technology here.
And we all know that ChatGPT is really, I used it in the last 2 weeks really good. And sometime we didn't have the time to summarize documents. So I feel like you provide it with the document you want to summarize, and it learns, once it goes through the document, it learns if you extract the abstract of this document, what is answer question inside, and you need to go through it and then revise it in your own version. Sometimes give false information, but I really like how it's operating and helping a lot of people, especially in non-English speakers with their writing abilities. But I'm very concerned about this. How secure is it? For especially for in the last 2 weeks, there was a data breach, and financial information, private information for customers were leaked out. So I just advise everyone to be very helpful when you use a tool like that, and I can't wait to see what the future will bring.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to do this in a year's time and see where we've got to. I have a suspicion we'll have massive changes will happen between today and a year from today.
Okay, thanks, Sri, for your question, and thanks, Matt, for the answer. Okay, I will ask you a question. What do you think for the future of GeoChatGPT? You talked about the strength and weakness points for the GeoChatGPT. So what do you think is that weakness points and will be improved in the next future? As you know, in the last months, the GeoChatGPT has been developed and enhanced rapidly. As now, it's better than before in using all the tools. So, what is your point of view about the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of people are looking at this, and again, I think that the newest version of ChatGPT is a massive advance. This 4.0 version on 3.5. They're still exploring what ChatGPT is and where it's going to go to. So they're still in this very early stage of what they've released. And remember, they've spent hundreds of millions on this. So this is a big deal. I think it's up to our community to think through. And again, GeoChatGPT remains something of a, you know, there's a danger of building something, but that whole notion, if we build it, they will come, is a common mistake in our industry and outside. I think one has to weigh up where this is all going to and understand ChatGPT's part in this world and where you might take something like GeoChatGPT. We have some interesting thoughts. And again, this is mostly a conversation. There's some little things on the back end of this, but it's mostly a conversation, and we're learning as we explore and think about it where this potentially goes to. And I think it's one step at a time, watching what's happening with ChatGPT, but the whole idea of having your own database, which is able to answer specific geospatial questions. Again, the journey that one takes one down in geospatial, that's not in the databases that ChatGPT has. So you need to build your own database that contains that information. So a very geospatial database that's able to answer these questions. And it isn't just a GIS simple two-dimensional map question. The perspective that those are sort of chat, within the sort of GeoChat world, GeoChatGPT world is it's a bigger conversation, that because the direction that geospatial is going is multidimensional, like I mentioned. So we're moving away from just 2D maps to 3D and 4D, and what I've sort of started to call augmented digital reality, where you can actually, like I mentioned, you can have a three-dimensional point cloud or a three-dimensional world, and you can see a tree that's yellow is an ash tree. Well, that's sort of an augmented version. It's what you can't see with your eyes, but thanks to analytics and AI doing a chunk of analytics, you can show that stuff now. So I think the future that we're going down from an output perspective is a multi-dimensional output. Initially, it'll be sort of 2D, it'll be a 2D output. But I think we're still too early in the game to actually really dive in and build anything. I mentioned that sort of the recipe instructions and how important that piece is. How do you learn how does ChatGPT learn? Because ChatGPT learns. This kind of a system, a geospatial system, would need to learn, but it's not going to just self-learn. It's going to need input from geospatial experts. So I think that the learning part of this is crucial. And if, for example, let's take a more complex example, like show me the best locations of Salt Lake City for a Starbucks. We know there's a lot of stuff that sits behind that. If GeoChatGPT in its first instance come back with an answer, it would almost need the person answering the question, expert, to say, no, you know what, you've missed a couple of steps there. So the manual side of inputting information into the system, not just self-learning, but the manual side of it is critical. And that's how over time it's going to learn the nuances of solving these problems. Because at the moment, we don't document. I mean, you can go to an API, you can go and generate code, you can do all those type of things. But when you start to get to answer more complex geospatial questions like that one, there's multiple steps to it. It isn't necessarily just a 2D map output. It might be, but it might not be. Foot traffic, for example, is an important part of making those kind of decisions. There's all sorts of pieces of the puzzle. Those pieces are complex. And I think over time, the learning part of a GeoChatGPT with the input from experts like you guys on this call would be building out that kind of a system. So we're some way away from that. But I think as time goes by and we start to think through this stuff, the path forward is much clearer.
Okay, Matt, thank you. We have another question. Haneen asked, could you please suggest courses for GIS and AI? She is asking about education resources, how she can start to learn about AI in GIS field.
I am the wrong person to answer that question. I don't know. I really don't know. Nothing even comes to my mind. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I could give you a good answer, but I really don't have one.
It's okay. Maybe you can find for us and post it on your LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'll talk to the AI, one of my AI guys that I work with, and I'll ask him exactly that question, see what he comes back with. So if he gives me something that's helpful, I'll for sure share it.
Okay, maybe you can advise us about the steps to starting as a developer or using AI. How we can starting as a fresh graduated to be a developer in GIS?
In GIS?
Yeah, as you
Oh,
said, you are a developer, so it's your
yeah.
core.
You know, I started developing in 1996. And at that time, the GIS department had no relationship with computer science. And so I
Oh,
had to go to computer science to learn how to be a programmer, to then bring that back to the geography department. So my path was a challenging one. I think that the path now for people is much easier.
yeah,
But
yeah,
my
understood.
suggestion to folks is to learn Python. I mean, if you're going to learn a programming language, learn Python. Python is the language which is probably the most valuable language in being a developer in the world of geospatial and GIS. So that would be my sort of go-to one.
Okay, great. Also, me, I recommend Python. I saw last days some posts talking about it that GeoChatGPT will be better instead of language programming language. But I'm sure that no, that's not right. We will not using GeoChatGPT instead of programming language. This is my
No.
point to yeah.
Oh, well, I think now ChatGPT can generate code for people. So again, I mentioned the fact that developers, I'm not quite sure what that looks like for developers, but I think it will be like the pilot of the plane again. I think some of the basic programming that needs to be done is going to be done by these LLM-powered chatbots. They're only going to get more sophisticated. It doesn't mean that people that are really talented as developers are going away, but I think some of that more basic stuff is going to be done by ChatGPT. I think that where GeoChatGPT comes into that, we're still, there's still a debate about what that is. And again, it's still largely an academic conversation, but I think that to have the power of having the ability to generate code, to generate an output automatically is incredibly powerful. So ChatGPT potentially generates code and brings back, it may be in, and again, I'm just this totally off the top of my head, but maybe in combination with ChatGPT, we can ask a geospatial question, generate code through ChatGPT, and then use the spatial engines on the back end of GeoChatGPT to generate some output. So I think that I'm not sure how to answer this whole world of being a developer, that question about how do I learn to be a developer? I think the developer world is going to change. So I think that the gap that I think, and this is maybe a digression, but I think the biggest gap in the world of geospatial is people that can understand how to solve problems using geospatial data and technology. It's less about the technology per se. It's much more about guiding folks down the path to a solution. So the examples I've given, the transportation example with the safety, it takes a geospatial thinker to go through that journey. You're talking to engineers, so there's safety engineers that are trying to diagnose a problem at an intersection and put a roundabout there, for example. They don't necessarily think geospatially, so they can't navigate the path I've just described. You look at a 2D map, you see the patterns, you load all these different data sets in there. We know which data sets to put in there. You look at it in 3D, you build these other data, you enrich it with these other data sets. You bring in real-time data. Those guys don't know how to do that. We do, but it's less about building out the pieces, programming those pieces. It's more about connecting the dots. And I think if folks here are geographers, have a geographic background, your core skill set is that. I've always argued this point. You're not map makers. Maps are just a small part of GIS. It's just incidentally that GIS ended up in the geography department. Cartographers are map people. We're dot connectors. And I always make the point that if you're a human geographer, and I use two local examples, you answer questions like, why did the Mormons settle in Salt Lake City? In 150 years ago, the Mormons came across, or 200 years ago, they came across America. They settled in this valley. Why did they do that? That's a human geography question. Now, there's a locational component to it, but you're kind of trying to understand the reasons. Was it water? Was it because it was surrounded by mountains, so it's protection? A whole load of human geography questions. Physical geography would be, I live in the mouth of a canyon here. It's a V-shaped canyon. Why is that one V-shaped and yet 3 miles down the road, there's a U-shaped canyon. Why are they one V and one U? You know, those are the type of questions that we answer, and we connect the dots to say these processes, you know, this geology, all these things that we are really good at connecting dots. And I think the need in geospatial is probably, I'm not going to say it's less technical, because it's not, because we're very technical, but I think that thinking through the answers to questions and using our abilities as dot connectors is our secret sauce, our real power. And I think most of the rest of the world don't understand the value of geographers, because we are exceptional dot connectors. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
Okay, great, Matt. We have another question and suggestion. Let's start with the question. Musk and other tech CEO are proposing that further development of AI be halted for proper regulation to be put in place, which raises a lot of security questions. Even as GIS is basically about location, do you think we should take precision, yeah, in how we use GeoChatGPT, and do you think governments and other bodies should put enough regulatory measures in place to guide GeoChatGPT?
Oh, undoubtedly, that's going to happen. I think we're at that stage where it's like anyone that follows the cryptocurrency marketplace and the evolution of that. There's all sorts of activity there. People think it's sort of a con, or but there's real technology there. But how we apply it and where it's going to go to is still an unknown. I think ChatGPT is just out, you know, just open the doors. So at the minute we're trying to figure the thing out, but I think that regulation is much discussed in the crypto marketplace, and they'll put regulation there. But I mean, that's been around for years and years now, crypto world, and yet they're still in America, still wondering what to do about regulation, how they're going to do it, you know, what they're going to do. We're a way off with ChatGPT, but the questions are really a good ones. I think it's absolutely important. Yeah, really important. So how they best do that, I don't know. And I'm sure the politicians are looking at it and thinking, oh my gosh, when do we even begin here? So I think we're a way off yet, but yes, regulation is going to be something that's going to be a big talking point in the near future, I think.
Okay, sorry, John, if you want to talk, I can unmute you and talk furthermore. Okay, great. Okay, we had a suggestion from Sharif. Actually, Sharif, we started our series a week ago. Last Saturday, we had a session in AI plus GIS. So you can follow us. We will continue this series. We will have 2 sessions in each Saturday, next Saturday, and then next Saturday. We will continue talking about embracing AI in GIS. I hope that you got my point. Okay, if you have any question, please send it. If you don't, we will conclude the conversation. Sorry. I think we don't have any question more.
People can reach out to me on LinkedIn if they wanted to know anything else, if I haven't answered anything, or yeah, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah.
Give you my perspective, right or wrong.
Yeah, sure. If you have any question, please send direct message to Matt. We already sent his LinkedIn profile link to chat box. You can follow him and feel free to ask him directly, as he mentioned. Okay, thank you, Matt. Thank you for this wonderful talk, and really happy to have you all today. And thank you for being with us during this night.
Thank you. And again, I emphasize your organization is fantastic. I thoroughly support you. You're great. Thanks for the
Yeah,
invitation.
we hope to see you again in next events.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks
Yeah,
to everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you, and good night, good evening, or good morning, where you are. As you met, good afternoon.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye bye.